care and growth model is based on research that I had conducted with a group of colleagues at the Chamber of Mines Research Organization of South Africa in the 1980s. A significant component of that work was focused on what we then called management communications and was conducted by my boss at the time, a man by the name of Volker Hoiberg. We were convinced at the outset that management really didn't have much to lose. In fact, they could only gain by being seen to be talking to employees with the intent of keeping employees informed on matters that affected both the employees themselves and the company. This was the view we held at the time of our first investigation of management communications on a mine in the Orange Free State in 1986. Management on this mine shared our conviction and had put a lot of effort into communicating with their people, inter alia by means of videos produced by their own studio and newsletters. Videos featuring managers speaking about various and mostly contentious issues were shown throughout the hostel after work when people came back from shift. To our astonishment, we found that employees who had seen a manager on one of these videos trusted management less than those who had not. And to add to our confusion, we found that men who had read the mine's newsletter trusted management, whereas those who had not distrusted management. This landed us with a very interesting but thorny problem. Why was exposure to one management-associated source connected to poor trust and exposure to another connected to high trust? Volker Hoiberg agonized over this for weeks until it occurred to him that, like Romeo commenting on Juliet in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the video speaks yet it says nothing. The video would have been seen by semi-literate mine workers at the time as a very sophisticated medium. Bear in mind, we only got TV in the mid-70s. One which would very easily make them feel that they were being subjected to propaganda. It seemed to be regarded as a ploy by management to get employees to swallow contentious information. The crux of the matter is that the video is poorly equipped to fulfill the basic function of communication, which is to impart information. The aim of speech, for example, is not just to make a noise. I mean, that might be pleasurable, but it's also to convey content from the speaker to the listener. However, content is only useful to the listener if it is truthful. Because of its transience, the video is highly unlikely to be perceived as a credible source of information, because you see it now and then you don't. You cannot store the information you get from a video under your bed and take it out on a later occasion to test its validity against another source. This is particularly true if the content is contentious. A newsletter, on the other hand, can be stored and later retrieved to check information. Based on this research, we made the following recommendations to the Chamber of Mines members. If you have a problem and you need to communicate, you should bear in mind that content is the central concern in communication, and that content has to do with truth. In other words, speak the truth. In the second place, don't go overboard with media, because this can be expensive and futile. Keep it simple. Put it in writing. Speak the truth, put it in writing. That was our dictum. What we had to say at the time made sense to a number of people, including management of a mine that had decided that in lieu of adapting technology, large numbers of employees would be retrenched. These managers knew that these retrenchments would result in sort of industrial relations problems, and that they wanted to somehow manage this by communicating. They thought they would preempt the problem by speaking the truth and putting in writing. So twice a week for 6 months, they distributed a brief signed by the mine manager informing employees that they could expect to be retrenched in the near future. The employee would find this frightening message on his bed after returning to the hostel after work. We arrived into his room in the hostel. There would be the brief on his bed. The effect of this was devastating. Trust in management plummeted from a marginally negative score in 1986 to absolutely negative in 1987. The only source of information that was used by more than 50% of employees, all the sources were associated with the union. And the brief that was being pumped into this hostel twice a week was only being read by 44% of the men. The poorest source of communication by management was the public address system in the hostel, which only had 11% of people still giving it any attention. This hardly came as a surprise, since the public address system was used on a daily basis to announce the list of company numbers and names of people who had to report to the hostel manager's office for their severance packages. As could be expected, along with this total withdrawal of attention from formal media, most men felt that management was also untrustworthy. These managers had heeded to our advice. This manager had heeded to our advice. They had spoken the truth, they put it in writing, and it had an absolutely disastrous outcome. However, on careful examination, this is hardly surprising. I mean, let's assume that your grandmother, who you adore, is sitting next to you chatting, and let's assume you're not a major beneficiary in a will, and suddenly a livid man bursts into the room with a wild look in his eye, frothing at the mouth and a gun in his hand, screaming that he's going to kill your granny. This man's obvious truthfulness in the matter will certainly not be a recipe for trust between the two of you. So speaking the truth, let alone putting in writing, is hardly a foolproof way of earning loyalty and trust. At this point, we realized that there was something else in the whole issue of management communications or leadership communications that we had yet to discover. Just what the secret ingredient was became apparent in the course of a fascinating climate survey we did on Vaal Reefs West during the 1987 wage review strike. This was a unique study, since we were conducting interviews on the mine immediately prior to the strike. We had been at it for a week interviewing, and then the strike started, at which time we had to withdraw our interviewing crew from the mine for the ensuing 3 weeks of the strike. The day those employees had returned back to work, however, was the day that we resumed interviews. So we had this fascinating before and after take on the employee opinion over a strike. On one of the shafts of this mine, namely 5 Shaft, there had been an intriguing shift in the sources which employees used for information over the strike period. Before the strike, the only source of information that was regarded by more than 70% of the men was the union mass meeting. After the strike, the union mass meeting was still considered to be important, but the written brief distributed by management rose from a 57% response to an 82% response, and the public address system in the hostel increased from a 38% response before the strike to an 84% response after the strike. Such a dramatic shift in attendance to management media suggested to us at the time that managers on 5 Shaft had really gotten something right in their communication with employees. Exactly what this was came to light when we asked workers why management communications on the shaft had been so effective. Responding to the question, one man said that they had been so effective because management used the public address system and the written briefs to say something. During the time of the strike, this man said, a certain Mr. Botha was using the public address system begging us to go back to work. The fact that this man could name Johan Botha, the production manager in charge of the shaft, was of paramount importance. Johan Botha was promoted to being the production manager in charge of 5 Shaft in 1986 after a particularly gruesome series of events. There had been a union-organized execution of 4 team leaders or supervisors from the shaft. They were brought before a large group of singing hostel residents. They were made to stand up on wooden tables and were stabbed to death with broken charge sticks. Unfortunately, because all 4 of these men were Sothos, there was a massive mobilization of Sothos against Xhosas at the end of the shaft, on the shaft, because Sothos was saying these people are killing our countrymen. In the course of these events, Johan Botha was promoted to being the next manager in charge of the shaft. He At that stage, by the time he joined, all production had ceased on the shaft. He addressed this problem by entering into the hostel all by himself. No weapons, no security support, armed only with a megaphone. He walked into the center of the fray where people were killing each other in hand-to-hand combat, and he appealed to people over this megaphone to stop killing each other. This is how he introduced himself to his men. Subsequently, Johan Botha repeatedly demonstrated this very real human concern for his people. He set the scene for the remarkable response of his employees during the 1987 wage review strike, which took place about 18 months after the fights of 1986. On the first day of the 1987 wage review strike, 5 Shaft struck with the rest of the industry. The 5,000 men of 5 Shaft were on strike with the 44,000 employees on Vaal Reefs and the 500,000 employees in the gold mining industry. On the second day of the strike, Johan Botha went to the hostel, and over the public address system of the hostel, he appealed to his men to go back to work. His men heeded his call and returned back to work, despite the fact that this message was an obviously exceedingly contentious message. This was the biggest single wage strike in South African history. All the other shafts on Vaal Reefs remained on strike. In fact, people elsewhere in Vaal Reefs were being necklared for trying to bust that strike. In other words, the men on 5 Shaft accepted a message of immensely questionable content because it came from Johan Botha. Secondly, not only did the men attend to the content of the message, but from then on, they listened to the public address system. This is not because it's such an exceptional medium. On the contrary, it is technically poor. It buzzes and distorts, and that particular system buzzed and distorted. In addition, it suffers from the same problem as the video. I mean, the content is transient. You hear it now, and then it is gone. But the reason why employees paid attention to this medium is because this man, this Johan Botha, was using the medium. In other words, both the content and the medium gained credibility because they were associated with a man who had credibility. This suggests that insofar as the issue of content is an ethical one, since it's principally concerned with truth, it also raises the key issue of the truthfulness of the speaker. In simple terms, if I trust you, I believe in what you're telling me, and this trust cannot just be gained through mere speech. The speaker has to act in such a way as to convince the listener that he's sincerely interested in them and is not just concerned with what he can get out of them. Management communication is therefore concerned with 3 issues, each of which contain each other like layers of an onion. On the periphery, we find the issue of least importance, which is the medium. You can actually get any medium to work for you, even a video or a public address system or whatever. Inside the medium, we find a more fundamental concern, which is the issue of content. What is being said here? Remember that content is actually an ethical idea because it is concerned with truth. In other words, this truthfulness places a requirement of honesty on the leader. And this suggests that within the issue of content resides the most fundamental concern with regard to management communication, namely the credibility of the source. Who are you to be saying these things? If I can trust you, I'll believe and I'll accept what you have to say. On the other hand, if I cannot trust you, I will be suspicious of whatever you have to tell me, even if it is the truth. After all, as we saw from the example of management who briefed their employees on their impending retrenchment, the truth can be used very successfully to terrorize people. The essence of successful leadership communication is therefore the same elements that renders leadership success substantive. It is by actively pursuing the well-being of the subordinate that the leader earns loyalty, trust. No amount of talking, however, doesn't matter how flowery it is or how eloquently expressed, will achieve the same results. In fact, if the employee knows from experience that no one is concerned with him or his problems, this kind of rhetoric will only serve to make him cynical. This perspective also serves as a comment on the provision of information by leaders. Volker Hooijberg believed that caring leaders will make it their business to keep their people informed on aspects that will affect them. While this is obviously true, it may well obscure the fundamental issue, which is really concerned with the intent of the leader. Let's take as an example the question of whether employees should be briefed regularly on the financial performance of the company. In the 80s, I knew of 2 mines who had subscribed to this policy. However, it's interesting that both of these operations were marginal at the time. In other words, they were in financial difficulty. This leads one to suspect that leaders were briefing employees in order to focus their attention on the weak financial performance of the company. An employee who is alerted to the fact that the company and therefore his job is on unstable ground, in other words, is less likely to engage in disruptive industrial action. What is therefore presented as a generous and empowering provision of information is actually a control mechanism that is used in order to invoke fear. This acid test as to whether the leader is prepared to provide financial information for the right reason operates when the leader is prepared to brief employees when the operation is highly profitable. It's astonishing how few leaders are prepared to do this. I recall a particularly acrimonious interaction between Volker Heuberg and a senior person at Valries West, who at the time was by no means a poor leader, with regard to this very issue. It's fine to give people financial performance, the financial information, if the mine is marginal, this manager said. However, here at West Division, Valries, we are making a profit.